The month of November is a vitally important time for anniversaries of important conspiracies. Of course, the 50th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Also, not to be deterred, also the 16th anniversary of the Montreal Screwjob, November 9th, 1997, between Vince McMahon, Bret Hart, and Shawn Michaels. Joining us now to discuss the Montreal Theory and the Montreal Screwjob, we have former WWE referee of 22 years and the author of the new autobiography, 3 Count My Life in Stripes, as a WWE referee, Mr. Jimmy Korderas. Are you with us, sir?
Yes, I am. How are you doing, guys?
Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Let's get right into it right now. We're talking Montreal Theory. You were there that night on November 9th, 1997 in Montreal when Vince McMahon purportedly masterminded the plot to screw Bret Hart out of the WWF title without his permission. What do you remember from that night? What was the vibe like in the building?
Well, going into it, I mean, like, from a standpoint from what we knew, or what I knew as a referee, we were told that the match was going to end in some kind of a non-finish with a bunch of run-ins, and we were going to run down and break things up. And when what actually happened went down, it was stunning. I mean, like, it took me a while to figure it out. I mean, like, there was a few guys there who figured it out right away. Of course, me not being one of them, I was kind of like, what the heck just happened here? And it took a little while, and then, of course, everybody's kind of like confused. Okay, was this a big, like everybody thinks, it's wrestling, so obviously this must have been some kind of master plan that they didn't let the boys in on. But as things unfolded, and we've talked about this before. As time went on, you start questioning whether what happened was legit. Was it not legit? Was it a big work? Was it not a work? But that night, it was just shocking. You can just see people walking around like zombies, not knowing what to do next.
So, really, the afternoon of the event, before any of this had gone down, you really had no idea what you were in store for that day, did you?
No, not at all. I mean, like, to be honest with you, I don't think Earl did, but I didn't see him much that day. And, thinking back upon it, I didn't think much of it because, I'm busy doing my stuff during the day, as far as, like, setting up and that sort of stuff. So it's not uncommon for us not to run into Earl for a little while during the day and stuff like that. And we're running into a lot of the guys, and you go over your match and find out what you're doing that night and that sort of thing. So you're kind of preoccupied. And when something like this happens that you don't expect, in a million years, I really didn't sense anything. At least I didn't anyways.
Now, you've had a chance to watch the Montreal Theory, available now on DVD and digital download in MontrealTheory.com. For those listening that may be unaware, what we purport as part of the Montreal Theory is that in some way, form, or fashion, it is highly probable that Bret Hart and Vince McMahon were co-conspirators together on this plan based on a slew of unanswered questions and circumstantial evidence that points to the fact that we don't know the whole. That is, as I said, available now still on MontrealTheory.com. At the end of the day, to me, much like a JFK, much like a 9/11, much like a lot of issues that the public in general is more and more questioning the validity of, based on agendas, based on money, based on power, you can apply all of that in a very similar microcosm to Montreal, which arguably is the most influential moment in wrestling in the modern era. You've had a chance to see the theory start to finish. Tell us what your mindset was following all the evidence and debate that we presented to you.
After watching it, and there was a lot of good stuff on there. I mean, like, and some interesting theories from different people, and and a lot of smart people, going over the theories, and trying to look back at things. You're right. There are a lot of stuff. There are a lot of unanswered questions, and that make you go back and think, well, why did this happen, and why, and how would like a little thing, for example, like Bret Hart being wired and going into Vince McMahon's office, and Vince, knowing at the time that this documentary was being filmed on Bret Hart, so, how did Vince let his guard down and that sort of thing? And you think, well, Vince McMahon would never let his guard down. That's you know what I mean? Little things like that. Like I said, it actually raises more questions, and I've gone back and forth on whether I think there was at least a little bit of the work element put into this. But at the end of the day, when I think back on everything that happened, I mean, it's a tough one. I mean, I think sometimes that you play out these scenarios in your mind. I always try to come up with these big scenarios, like maybe they did come up with this big master plan where Vince says, go to WCW and make a boatload of money for a couple of years, and we'll build up Austin or even Shawn Michaels at the time, whoever it was, and then when the time is right, I'll bring you back as the guy to kind of right the ship for me and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, I don't think it, like a lot of people would say that if it wasn't for the tragic accident of Bret's brother Owen, Bret would have been back in the WWE a lot sooner. That I kind of agree with, but I don't think that had a bearing on what happened, because during that whole incident, I think, Bret, Bret wouldn't have kept kayfabe. You know what I mean? Bret was legitimately pissed at the company after that horrible incident in Kansas City, and I don't think he would have, maintained that illusion just for the sake of maintaining kayfabe. I think something would have came out then, if anything.
Which is very possible, although I think you could look on the other end of the coin and say that would probably be a very bad time for Bret to come out and admit that to his family with everything that was going on. But to me, looking at Bret in general, obviously you had probably at least a decent rapport with him, being on the road with him for over a decade. Of course, you're both Canadian. Bret has been in the business all his life. He's very old school, very smart for the business. He's been around it since day one. Does it surprise you how this entire Montreal story portrays him as sort of this naive, myopic, almost petulant at times, overly trusting victim? Does it seem odd to you that someone who should be so smart for the business got so duped so blatantly?
Yeah, well, see, that's part of the whole the whole thing. You're exactly right. When you take someone like Bret Hart and little things like when he talks about, if I'm not mistaken, it was the night before in Detroit, speaking to Earl Hebner and saying, I think they might try to screw me, or whatever the wording was that he said, speaking to Earl that he thought something might be up the next night at the pay-per-view. Again, when he says stuff like that of course that brings up red flags, and you're going, well, wait a minute, why would he think something like that would happen if, so, he comes off a lot as the victim, but at the same time, I know a lot of people also, without naming names, some guys were saying, well, you know what, he kind of had it coming, and I'm not going to make make a claim as to whether he had it coming or not. I mean, it was what it was, but some guys weren't very sympathetic towards him, which I found very odd.
There's a lot of we talk about some of the coincidences, some of the inaccuracies, or the fact that, as you said, potentially being a victim. Other people would say, $2.5 million, $3 million a year. There was no victim. Everything worked out perfect. Everybody got what they wanted. Vince got to take the belt away from Bret. Shawn got to win and Bret got to lose without really losing, because people obviously had known the quote-unquote real story pretty shortly thereafter. There's a lot of other things in this story. The seamless launch into the Attitude Era, Vince versus Austin being pretty much a blueprint, Stone Cold screwed Stone Cold, blatantly based off of Bret Hart. The film crew filming it that we touched on. Bret and Vince discussing the match finish weeks in advance, which was documented in the Dave Meltzer recap of the entire thing a week before the show. Vince pitched a screw job finish to take the belt off of Bret, where Bret potatoes Vince in the face, punches him hard way to make it look legit, which is exactly what happened. Is there anything that you saw in the Montreal Theory that really stands out to you as a smoking gun, as, I never really thought about it like that, and I can't explain it away?
Yeah, there's trying to think back, because I saw it a little while back, and I should go back and refresh myself, because it was good, and there was so much in there. If there's one thing, you got to go back, and I hate to single out one person in this video, because there were a lot of good points by a lot of people, but someone else who was there at the time as well is Kevin Kelly. Kevin Kelly has a lot of good points in this video, and he, you know what, people should go check it out and listen to what he has to say as well, because he was there at the time as well. So, and he has a good insight into some questionable stuff that went on at the time. Let's just say it that way. But to pinpoint one specific one, it's kind of hard, because there is a lot of good points in there.
Well, I think one thing that really points to the fact that we don't know everything is there's some discussion about who came up with the idea of the specific sharpshooter finish, which is credited to Pat Patterson, but a lot of insiders believe Pat was largely kept in the dark because he wouldn't have gone along with this. Another claim is that, and this is something that Meltzer has said, that he cannot reveal his knowledge of who came up with this finish until his source passes away. So there are moving parts and components to this that we don't know, and consequently to that as well, when I had approached a very prominent ex-WWF employee who was around at the time about appearing in Montreal Theory, they had told me they cannot appear because, quote, I don't want that kind of heat, who I won't out by name here, but, I mean, all of this points to me that there's a lot more underneath the surface that we don't know about, we're not supposed to know about, and maybe help the people involved, pull this con, which I don't say negatively, wrestling is based on a lie, but pull this con nonetheless, and make a lot of money off of this false reality.
Well, you know what? Like I said, I keep going back and forth on this thing, and you mentioned earlier, who was the mastermind behind coming up with this idea in the first place. I've heard stories, and like you said, I don't want to name names, that so-and-so had come up with the idea and that sort of thing, and you're right. I mean, like I said, I keep going back and forth. I want to believe that this was not an elaborate work, and this was, for selfish reasons, and think that this was just the so-called evil boss doing what he thought was right for his company and that sort of thing. But at the same time, if this is what a lot of people think it is, and what could possibly still be, like, we don't know, and if it is the greatest work of all time, if this is in fact a work, and like I keep saying, and I know I say it a lot, I keep going back and forth on it, and I say to myself, you know what? There's no way that this thing was a work, and then all of a sudden, I keep thinking, and then I think back to certain things, like you said, and then something that Kevin Kelly would say in the DVD would kind of spark something and go, wait a minute, that's kind of odd, now that I think of it, and that sort of stuff, and maybe we have to wait till Meltzer can actually reveal what he knows.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll get a deathbed confession like we allegedly got for JFK from E. Howard Hunt. But you know, talking about Kevin Kelly, and I got to mention Steve Corino as well, who was fantastic as kind of the lead skeptic, and something that you could tell he's been thinking about it for 16 years. He's a big proponent of Vince and Bret being in collusion together. Now, even though you were not in the actual match, you were involved in the pull-apart at the start of the match between Bret and Shawn. To me, as a viewer, it's very obvious that something is going against the grain, against the norm, when you see Vince McMahon and Sergeant Slaughter staying at ringside for the match. Vince was still the television commentator at this point, but he was not commentating. He had done a backstage promo saying, who's going to win, dramatic pause, I don't know, which to me was a blatant setup for the Mr. McMahon character. Whether Bret knew what that was or not, I think Vince knew what it was, which lays claim to me that it was premeditated, that Vince was doing it to help business in the future rather than a spur-of-the-moment decision. But in the back, whether it be you or any of the other reps or staff or workers or anything, I mean, did this seem unusual that Vince was at ringside after the pull-apart had died down, he had not left?
Didn't think of it at first. I mean, when Vince came out with the rest of us for the pull-apart, that's when I found it odd. Because, whether if it was Sergeant Slaughter and Jerry Briscoe and those guys coming out to help with the pull-apart, they're the agents that you see on TV, frequently, actually, in those days, coming out to do the pull-aparts, along with the referees. But when Vince came out, I thought it was odd, but at the same time, I was thinking maybe he's just trying to add importance to this thing. I didn't, you know what I mean? That's what actually happened was the furthest thing from my mind. But that's what I found out, that he was out there from the get-go of the pull-apart, and screaming, get these guys apart and that sort of stuff, and doing his thing. That's what I found out. And then when he stayed out there, I just figured it was part of the match that had been discussed. I didn't know,
Take us back to the aftermath behind the scenes right after the pay-per-view had ended. We got a great account from Kevin Kelly on Montreal Theory, where he had talked about seeing some things from his vantage point nobody had seen before. What are your memories of what was going on backstage at the Molson Center, which I'm sure had to have been absolute anarchy by that point?
I remember, like I said, waiting at Gorilla for the cue to go out and break up the schmoz that was supposed to happen at the end of the match, and when it didn't happen, obviously we didn't run out there. Everybody was like, what the hell just happened? And you could see there was a few guys upset, and there was a few guys confused, and when I got to the back, I'm standing there, like I said, trying to understand what was going on, and then I remember Shawn coming through the curtain, into the back and screaming stuff like, "What the hell was that? That's BS," and throwing the title down, saying, "I'm not taking it that way," and all this kind of stuff. And I guess that was part of the illusion, I guess, so to speak. So at the time, I thought to myself, well, maybe he didn't know what was going on. You know what I mean? You don't know what to think because it's fresh in your mind. It just happened. It's something that I had never witnessed in my life. I mean, people look back at the old Wendy Richter Spider-Woman thing, but that nowhere near the impact that this thing did. You know what I mean? So it was really weird. And the guys, it was just, Bret came to the back and went straight to Vince's office and pounding on the door, and of course he wasn't going to open the door and let him in at that time, and it was just chaos. I mean, everybody standing around pretty much stunned.
Yeah, and it's another great point that for the first 4 or 5 years, Shawn had flat out denied it, and a lot of people had believed that Shawn was not involved until he came out and said that he was part of a plan to screw Bret. Of course, the conspiracy theorists and the Montreal theorists out there I think the most logical thought there is there were probably two conspiracies going on. There was the conspiracy to screw Bret that we were all made aware of, and I think, in the opinion of many, possibly including me, my opinion changed as well, a second, more secretive conspiracy where maybe just between Vince and Bret, and we talk about it on the DVD, it could have happened the night before Survivor Series, could have happened the year before Survivor Series. There's a lot of different moving parts and a lot of different combinations that could have led into this. But we didn't know Shawn's role for so long. I don't think it's completely out of the question that Bret or Vince could still be up in the air as well. But I know we're running a little short on time, but I want to briefly get a few more things out with you. Mostly, I want to touch on Earl Hebner's role in this, you being a referee for so long and being as respected in the field as you are. Just briefly touch on the tough position Earl was put in for this, and I know it's so tough to ask in hindsight if you do anything differently, but, I mean, you had to have thought about what would happen if you were put in a similar position.
Oh, absolutely, and Earl seems to be the forgotten guy in this whole thing. I mean, imagine the position he was put in. You're working with these guys closely day in and day out, and you're on the road with them, and there's that trust factor that goes on between a referee and the talent, and the talent needs to know that they, and it's not so much, like in this case we talk about, obviously a screw job, but just simple trust that you can trust the referee in the match and you don't have to worry about him regardless of whether it's positioning or whether he's going to remember the finish or whether he's going to remember spots or be able to do stuff. But, obviously Earl was one of the most respected referees ever, and him and Bret had a great rapport. So for him to be put in that spot, I can't imagine what he was thinking and what was going through his mind at the time, but you had to feel for him, and I know how terrible he felt about it at the time, and like you said, everybody asked, well, what would you have done? And it's easy to say, well, I would have stood on principle, or I would have done this, or I would have done that, and I probably, like, I'm going to be quite honestly, like a good soldier, I probably would have done what the boss asked me to do. At the end of the day, that's your job. You know what I mean? And you do what the boss asks you to do. And obviously, it's kind of a crummy thing to have to do to someone you consider a friend, but at the same time, it's a business thing. It's not like he's asking you to go out and commit a crime, so to speak. You know what I mean? So it's your job. And if he didn't do his job, then he'd be out of a job. And what, is he going to end up in WCW along with Bret doing whatever the heck? No. I mean, he's still got a family that he's got to support, so you got to feel for the guy, really.
I would agree with that. Now, you've talked about going back and forth on your feelings on was there a conspiracy, was Bret involved, did he know, how much did he know, did he find out on his own, or was he working in concert with Vince? I feel the same way as you. Putting this piece together, Montreal theory throughout much of 2011 and 2012 and into 2013, depending on what part of the DVD I was working on, my opinion varied. There are certain things that look so impossible to coerce and plan out and make work perfectly. And on the other side of the coin, there are so many questions that just seem illogical to answer from Bret's perspective, from Vince's perspective, whatever. Some of the behaviors and some of the trustworthiness just seem so far beyond what you would think would logically take place. I'll break it down to you because I'm 51-49. If you wanted to put a little bit of icing on this cupcake as far as your thoughts on this, I'll give you a two-part question. With the way everybody benefited, of course, taking the long-term effects you couldn't prepare for, the family issues and the health issues and everything that Bret, and to a much lesser extent, Shawn experienced, based on this incident, solely in Montreal, November 9th, 1997, is there a victim here at all? And what do you think the odds are that Bret knew something in advance, if not, was in concert with Vince in planning?
Okay, part one, was there a victim in this? To be honest with you, looking back on it now, I honestly don't think there was. And like you said, nobody could foresee the unfortunate circumstances with the concussion that Bret suffered, of course the tragedy in Kansas City and Shawn Michaels back and the whole bit. Nobody could foresee that happening. Now, if all of that, if you work on hypotheticals, if none of that would have happened, if Bret Hart's health would have been fine, if Shawn Michaels' back would have been fine, and the whole bit, you know what? Things would have been a lot different, and I'm sure you would have seen Bret come back. Now, as the second part of that question, how much do I think Bret knew, if he knew anything at all? The thing that makes me think that Bret was aware something was up, at least that something was up, was that comment that he spoke to Earl the night before. And that, and it was almost like he was testing the waters there. That's what it feels like, if you know what I mean, if that makes any kind of sense. But you know what? I wouldn't be surprised if Vince went to Shawn and said, "Hey, we're going to screw Bret," and Shawn was on board, and then behind Shawn's back, Vince went to Bret and said, "Hey, we think Shawn thinks he's in on the screw job, and don't tell him that you're in on it as well, and we got plans down the road." I mean, it's all very plausible, I think.
And that's something that even the most ardent of critics, such as Raven in Montreal Theory, who was dead against the theory the whole time, conceded it would have made sense to do as a last-minute finish because everybody got what they needed. Real quickly before we wrap this up, we want to talk about your book and get people to follow you online, but we want to remind everybody that it's MontrealTheory.com or search Montreal Theory on Facebook. But go to MontrealTheory.com. You can buy the DVD or the digital download. Almost 6 hours of back-and-forth debate. We go through the whole 18-month plot. We poke holes. We ask questions. So much more. Get it now, MontrealTheory.com. Jimmy, how can we find you and your book?
Books available pretty much everywhere. You can go to Amazon.com, .ca, .co, .uk, whatever it is. It's all over the place. ECWPress.com. If you can't find it, hit me up on Twitter at Jimmy Korderas, or you can find me on Facebook, same name, and I'll help you locate it. And of course, other projects in the works. Working on maybe doing some referee seminars. What do you think?
You know what? I think that's so crazy it just might work. Everybody, keep posted to Jimmy Korderas on Twitter, on Facebook. Keep in tune to me on Facebook at Joe_Dombrowski. We do have a DVD project we'll be getting to in the next several weeks. We'll be getting that out and a whole lot more. Jimmy, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to pick your brain for the past half hour.
Oh, my pleasure, Joe. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
All right, and thank you guys for listening. MontrealTheory.com. Ask questions, or else the only one getting screwed is going to be you. Thanks for listening.